අනුදින ජීවිතේ.
The power of the people is greater than the people in power. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is power, politics and money fighting corruption in the new normal. Joining us this evening on the show are Sankita Gunaratna, Legal Officer, Electoral Integrity Project, TISL. Also joining us tonight on the show is Dr. Dinesha Samaratna, Senior Lecturer, Faculty of Law, University of Colombo. Also joining us tonight on Face the Nation is Srinath Pereira, President's Counsel. A very good evening to the gentlemen and the two ladies for joining us tonight on Face the Nation to discuss about the future course of action as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. Let's start off tonight's show with Srinath Pereira, President's Counsel. Mr. Pereira, interestingly, we see a lot of political tug-of-war taking place right now as far as the country's political dynamics are concerned. Given the fact that the country is in a very precarious situation at the moment, how do you view the current politicians' roles in this current context as far as the go home slogan is concerned?
Well, it only indicates that a large section of the populace of this country is dissatisfied with the decisions that have been made by the persons who are in power. And it is in that background, I believe, that thousands of people have got onto the streets making the demand that the President and the Prime Minister and the government in general should step down and give over or hand over power to a different set of people. Now, as I see it, as a citizen of this country, during the last 2 years or 2.5 years, during which the present president has governed this country, ruled this country, most of the decisions that he had made are resulting in disaster. In the said circumstances, I believe the whole country is in the decline. People are suffering. People are struggling hard to survive. And placed in that situation, what I feel is that we have to bring an end to this problematic situation to which this country has been pushed into. And the only way out, as far as I see, or can I put it this way, in looking at a solution to the problem that we are facing today, one has to make sure that whatever that we do within the constitutional framework, within the rules and regulations which are applicable in this country. And also, even though some people are demanding that the government itself resign and go to the polls, in the present context, I don't think it can be done. So therefore, we will have to consider what's best for the country in the said circumstances where we can bring about a change for the better within the constitutional framework of this country.
Mr. Pereira, you've also been a political actor for a very long time, and now you are openly supporting one of the political parties who are calling for the resignation of the President and also the Prime Minister, that is the Samik Janabalawege. What is your thoughts about holding an election now? Because that is one of the calls made by the SJB as well, saying that we have to call for an election immediately and get the people's mandate to govern the country. Is that the way to go about as far as this current problem is concerned?
Personally, my personal view is that this is not the right time for us to go in for an election, because people are struggling to survive, and in that background, I don't think it's the time at which we should go to the polls. To me, I think that's out of the question. Subject to that, how do we resolve this problem? There are various methods that one may suggest. For instance, one might say, well, bring in no confidence motion in Parliament, or bring in a motion to remove the President or whatever. But all those are areas which are not easy to achieve. Can I put it this way? We have a problem at hand. The President, the Prime Minister and the others who are ruling the country are conscious of that. And if they truly are interested in settling this problem immediately within the constitutional framework, what I feel is that in the first instance, the President should tender his resignation. There are thousands of people who are on the road who are demonstrating and asking the President to leave. They say the President should leave. So in that context, and as a result, as I said, the economy is running down. No foreign investor will want to invest monies in this country. Tourists are not coming. As a result, day by day we find that there is a decline. So therefore, if the President and the Prime Minister are genuinely interested in the public, people of this country and the country, I think the first thing that should be done is the President should tender his resignation to the Speaker. Thereafter, Parliament will have to appoint somebody acceptable, a man with integrity, as the President for the balance period. Immediately thereafter, my view is, immediately thereafter, the Prime Minister should resign. Why I say that the President should first resign and then the Prime Minister is for the reason that if both resign together, there can be a type of anarchy in the country. In the sense, the moment the Prime Minister tenders his resignation, the Cabinet ceases to exist. So if the President resigns and at the same time if the Prime Minister also resigns, then we will have a situation where there is no President, there is no Prime Minister, and the Cabinet also ceases to operate. So in that situation, the easiest and the best scenario that we can think of will be, first for the President to tender his resignation, thereafter Parliament to appoint somebody acceptable as the President. Thereafter, I think there is people, a lot of people are asking, they are dissatisfied with the Rajapaksa administration. Thereafter, the Prime Minister to tender his resignation, which will automatically result in the Cabinet coming to an end. Parliament thereafter to elect a Prime Minister, a suitable person, and maybe a Cabinet of anything between say 15 to 20 people in my view.
Yeah.
And for them to carry on as an interim government for a period of maybe anything between 1 year to 2.5 years, during which time if the economy revives and we get back on our feet, then maybe at that stage we can go back to the polls.
But Mr. Pereira, what is the trust that we can place in these parliamentarians? Because we saw two members of parliament who were in the SLFP, Suren Raghavan, as well as Shanta Bandara, who was supporting the SLFP, overnight changed camp and went and supported the SLPP by obtaining ministerial positions. Today we saw Udega Mampila meeting Basil Rajapaksa and the President as well to formulate an interim government. So can you expect that from the parliamentarians who are right now in our legislature?
I do agree 100% with you that I think it's wishful thinking that the parliamentarians will respond in the best interest of the country. But as against that, I see that public agitation is increasing, and on Friday, if I understand it right, there's going to be a hartal and a general strike. Now, if I'm a person who is against general strikes and hartals, but in the present context, I think that is a must. And if that gets off the ground, I believe a situation will be created where both the President and the Prime Minister will have to rethink and move out voluntarily. If not, there's going to be anarchy in this country.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Srinath Pereira, President's Counsel. I now move my attention to Dr. Dinesha Samaratna, Senior Lecturer, Faculty of Law, University of Colombo. Dr. Dinesha, the President has got a mandate. He is the President for a period of time. In Sri Lanka, it's approximately around 5 years. Now, if you take this into account, why must the President resign? Now, Mr. Pereira is of the opinion that if you are to avoid an anarchy in the country, the President has to resign from his portfolio, and then subsequently the Prime Minister has to resign, and then you can appoint someone who has the mandate of the parliamentarians in order to take up the position of President and Prime Minister. But in the context of, if you look at from the perspective of the President, why must he resign?
That's an interesting question. I think the question requires some understanding as to what is the role of public office, especially elected office. This is not personal property. It is public service. And the Constitution sets out the minimum rules for public office. And those minimum rules, as you rightly pointed out, we elect a president by a national election for 5 years. And there are rules as to when the president can be impeached, he or she may resign, etc. But in between those 5 years, there are other constitutional values, moral values, political values that are also at play. And what we are seeing in Sri Lanka today is that the crisis stems from people's claim that the office bearer is not holding that office as per the constitutional values, the political values, and the moral values that that office must demonstrate. So when there is a crisis of legitimacy and a crisis of confidence, that is when you may be called upon to step down. And that is something we are all familiar with. You may have the legal right to hold an office, but you can lose your moral right to hold that office. You may lose your political right to hold that office. So people's sovereignty is not something that comes alive at an election and then disappears into thin air until the next election. Our constitution, for instance, says very clearly that people are sovereign, their sovereignty is inalienable. All sovereign power is being exercised under the constitution on behalf of the people. And I don't think I need to belabor the point. The ruling out on the streets is that the trust of the people has been betrayed, not just by the executive, but also by parliament. So that is what makes the case for the president, but also, I guess, the prime minister to step down.
Right. So, Dr. Dinesha, now constitutionally it's very clear that the parliamentarians can demand the resignation of the president, and we've seen instances in which in the the early 1990s, how a impeachment was to be brought against Ranasinghe Premadasa as well. And we are in a situation where the opposition has a big role to play. Do you think in this current context that the opposition is doing its role well enough? Because we see the protesters on the streets day in and day out. It's over 20 days for the protest at Golface. They are demanding for the resignation of the president. They want people to declare their assets. They want to ensure that the money that was stolen is brought back to the country. So the slogans are very clear. But do you think the opposition is playing its role? Are they playing their part well enough?
So it's important to understand the opposition is not one group. It's a group of different political parties coming together. And if you look at the role played by the different parties in the opposition, it's a mixed record. You have particularly, in my view, minority political parties continuing to uphold the tradition of dissent in parliament, Some of them have continued to disagree and be critical of the policy decisions made by the government. And right now we are in a situation where the SJB, the leading party in the opposition, has presented a fairly credible set of proposals for constitutional reform. As a citizen, am I satisfied with what the leading political parties in the opposition have done? I would say not. But we have to also remember that Parliament, as the legislative branch of the state, is weakened in an executive presidential system.
Right.
So you have to appreciate that perspective as well. But when we talk about the opposition, I think it's important to remember that it has different moving parts and it speaks in different voices.
Right. So, Dr. Dinesha, just I want to pick your brain on this notion as well that is running on the mindset of a lot of people in Sri Lanka at the moment. What if the Prime Minister resigns from his portfolio in the next 2 to 3 days, because it's been discussed very vividly across social media platforms as well as news media, mainstream media as well. So let's say the Prime Minister resigns from his portfolio, hypothetically. Who in Parliament would be best suited constitutionally to take up the role of Prime Minister if that case goes ahead?
So according to the constitution and according to traditions of parliamentary democracy, it is the member of parliament who enjoys the confidence of parliament who must be appointed as prime minister.
Right.
Who that is not for me to say. It's for parliament to decide. But I can't emphasize the fact that it must be a person who enjoys the confidence of parliament, because at the domestic level and from an international perspective, what happens in our political processes, what happens in our constitutional organs is very important, because we need a stable and legitimate government.
Right. So let me put some numbers to you, Dr. Dinesha. I know I don't want to do this, but then again, I have to do it. Henceforth, I'm going to put some numbers across. There are 54 members in the SJB. There are 41 members of the SLFP who are standing in as independent group, and they do not have a clear leader. At one point, there is Maithripala Sirisena in the limelight. At one point, there's Udegammampila and Vimal Weerawansa in the limelight. Now there's talk about Dallas Alaha being in the limelight. And then you have the SJB as well. In the SJB, there are talk about Sajid Premadasa to be the leader of the SJB and who could steer the country to the next trajectory. Then you have individuals like Sarath Fonseca. Then you have the likes of Dr. Harsha De Silva. So it's right now, it's a complete soup. Now we're trying to wonder, when the Prime Minister resigns from his portfolio, who are they going to appoint as the Prime Minister of the country?
So you are asking me a question which I shouldn't reply in media except as a citizen.
Right.
Right?
Okay.
So I am here in the capacity of someone who has studied law to speak on questions of law.
Right.
But I can tell you this, that any person who becomes a prime minister, what we would like to see is someone with integrity, someone with expertise, and someone who can speak to the people and lead with strength, courage, and empathy. I'm not going to say anything further.
So whoever is appointed as a Prime Minister has big shoes to fill in the next
of
few
course, it
months.
should be the case.
Right. So I now move my attention to Sankita Gunaratna, Legal Officer, Electoral Integrity Project, Transparency International, Sri Lanka. Sankita, nice to have you on the show after a very long time.
Thanks for having me,
you being on the show just prior to the elections last time around. Now, an election was held. We have a president, we have a prime minister. People are demanding that both of them step down. Recently, the Center for Policy Alternatives did a survey, and they found out that 96.2% of Sri Lankans believe that all politicians should be audited and that their unaccounted wealth should be confiscated. Now, TISL has been in the forefront in terms of making sure that individuals in Parliament declare their assets to the public, and only 10 members have done that so far. In your opinion, what steps must the civil society begin to press for in this time of need? Because we've had individuals on this very show saying that this is the time for reform, this is the time that we have to ensure that we have the proper system in place. In your opinion, what should be the role of the civil society at this juncture?
Yes. Just to respond to your question, yes, it's 10 current sitting members of parliament who have made their asset declarations public, and 13 in total. And one of them came forward after the protests started, actually. So when we look at why we ask for publication of asset declarations, it is purely because there needs to be a level of accountability from public representatives to their electors. So the current asset declaration system doesn't quite provide for this. It doesn't require publication of asset declarations prior to elections or even after elections. So what this means is that citizens don't have a right to be informed of who their elected representatives are going to be and what their financial interests are before they choose to elect. So in terms of the role of civil society at this point of time, it is to demand this level of accountability that we have been also talking about, but that is happening, Shamir. At this point of time, what the citizens need to do, they are doing. Of course, there might be a further level of self-reflection needed to think about how we ended up where we are, because these are our elected representatives after all. However, it is really for these politicians who are being held under the limelight right now to go beyond the rhetoric. Stop talking about, being willing to be audited and all of that, because there's no real legal mechanism to do that. What exists is an asset declaration system, and the first step you can take in terms of being, socially accountable. This is a form of social audit if you can make your asset declaration public to your electors. And it's also, Dinesh already talked about the trust deficit in people about their politicians. So this is not only a numbers game of proving your credibility and proving that you're not corrupt. It goes beyond that. It goes to actually demonstrate that you're willing to lay yourself bare before your electors and truly act in their interests, and are no longer reticent. You're no longer reticent about it. So to bridge that trust deficit, you need to think about things like asset declarations being made public, and also about things like election campaign financing. Who really pulls the strings when it comes to your actions when you're in the prime legislative arm of the state, when you're making policy, when you're making legislation? So talking about this point of confiscating assets, right? You mentioned how people are making this call. They're saying, give us our stolen money back. Now, in terms of a mechanism under the existing law, there are certain provisions in our local law that talk in the context of certain offenses like money laundering and all of that, to freeze assets. But if you look at even the asset declaration law, just for reference, under section 9, if you look at it, it talks about a court proceedings where a person has willfully misdeclared their assets. Now, everyone talks about how asset declarations are not potent, but if you look at the law carefully, it gives the power for a prosecution to take place, and where it is proved that a person has willfully misdeclared their assets, then those assets can be vested in the state. So what power is required is already in existence in the law to deal with the present crisis, to respond to the call of the people. But our law enforcement authorities need to act independently. Our police, our Attorney General, our Bribery Commission, all of these, the CID, even including the central bank, all these different arms of state need to carry out their functions independently. They need to, of course, be resourced. They need to be skilled up. But they need to carry out these functions independently and take action, at least now, where there is evidence, to take the action that the law enables you to do. So provision is sufficient in the law, but there's also improvements that can be made.
So Sakida, it's very evident that there is no single formula or a magic bullet to address corruption on the face of it. There is a lot of action, there is a lot of effort that needs to be taken in order to ensure that we fight corruption. in the mainstream media, may it be in civil society, so on and so forth. So in your opinion, what is the best methodology right now? Because we know that the Right to Information Act, which was passed in Sri Lanka a couple of years ago, also opens doors for many avenues for the civil society and even the journalists to inquire from their political actors as to where money has been spent. So in your opinion, how do you view this?
Yes, so if you had to think of a tool that citizens can use to fight corruption, the right to information would be one of the foremost tools that can be used, and it exists in Sri Lanka. But you have to understand that the right to information stands on two pillars. There is request-driven disclosure, and then there's proactive disclosure. If you look at our law, it provides for almost utopian levels of proactive disclosure, right, about government contracts prior to signing certain deals, development projects, all of that. In addition to that, any key decisions that are made by any public authority needs to be made proactively available. But what we are seeing in practice, now this is not to say that the right to information is not working. At the district levels, at the village levels, there are thousands of people on a day-to-day basis using the right to information law. But if you look at it at a central level, at our ministry levels, at cabinet level, we are finding that there is a lot of resistance and a lot of persistence required on the part of citizens and even journalists, as you can very well see, that requires you to appeal and end up before the commission, and this can take a certain amount of time. So it is not being implemented in the true spirit of implementation, because the right to information is based on the principle of maximum disclosure and the public interest. So even an information officer, the person who has to make that decision, needs to make that decision on that basis and make information publicly available. But if you think of tools and frameworks that are required to fight corruption, the polling booth is a key tool, right? So all of the corruption that we're seeing around us has, at the end of the day, also been enabled, in addition to personal accountability of politicians, public officials, it's also been enabled by citizens. So all of these questions have to be thought about not after the disaster has happened, but before that. You need to act preventatively, even at the polling booth. So we understand right now that there is the level of culpability that is so clear out on the streets of politicians and also public officials. But are we looking deeply enough at ourselves, at what made us enabled these systems?
So Sankita, when you look at the protests that have been launched in Galle and across Sri Lanka at various intervals, one thing is very evident, the fact that most of the people who are protesting want the government to go home. In your opinion, when you look at the protests that are taking place right now, even at Galle, there is no clear leadership. What do you fathom with all this that's taking place? You see people demanding the government to go home, but we saw the manner in which even the Prime Minister at one point said, if you are willing to have a discussion with me, I am open for it, I will open the doors for you to meet any minister of the government as well. So do you think we need leadership in the current context to fight a very autocratic government in play?
I would say we are just used to a certain form of protest, and what we are seeing right now is very different from that. So there is this almost natural yearning for a leadership, somebody to be negotiated with. But what you're seeing right now is that lack of leadership is lending power to these protests, because on a daily basis you're seeing different forms of social issues that have been festering even for years and decades coming out in this collective protest. So there's beauty and strength in that. And in terms of the calls, I think it's clear. There doesn't need to necessarily be leadership for the call of the protest to be clear. So beyond that, I don't think, I can't speak for the protest. It is up to those groups that are protesting who we support, as long as they're doing it peacefully. So it is for them to speak for themselves, but there are certain clear demands, and action is clearly required when the demands are clear.
Right, thank you very much, Sankita Gunaratna, Legal Officer, Electoral Integrity Project, Transparency International Sri Lanka. I open the floor for questions from our journalists. On to my immediate right is Deshan Gonavala. On to my immediate left is Azra Hassan. Let's start off with Azra.
Thank you, Shamir. I'll pose my first question to Mr. Srinath Pereira. Mr. Pereira, we see how politicians and authorities who are supposed to be independent in serving the country have come forward and admitted that certain decisions that they made were wrong and they were mistakes. So just because they come in front of a camera and admit to the fact that certain decisions were not thought through and were not implemented properly, is there a legal background where action can be taken against them, given the current economic situation of the country and how the country has fallen down, especially in terms of inflation and the fact that we had to resort to a debt default recently? How does that work?
As I see it, whatever we do will have to be within the constitutional framework. Now, as I said, as I see it, one of the main drawbacks that we faced during the last 2.5 years, amongst others, was the introduction of the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. As a result of implementing the 20th Amendment, I think if one looks at those provisions carefully, which you all are aware of, it has broken the backbone of an independent judiciary and the public service. For a country to prosper, if we are to control corruption or whatever, in my view, there must be independent institutions in place. With the bringing in of the 19th Amendment, even though it was not all perfect, to some extent I think we introduced certain safeguards which were in the direction of creating independent organizations. Even though it was not, I'm not fully satisfied with the changes that were brought in by the 19th Amendment, but at least to some extent, the public service, the judiciary and other organizations which ought to be independent were given some degree of independence. What did this government do immediately after coming into power? They brought in the 20th Amendment, which was certified on the 29th of October 2020. It broke the backbone of an independent public service. All important, speaking for myself, I have been in the Attorney General's Department for a period of over 21 years, and I see that a set of subservient public servants have been created as a result of the changes that were brought in with the 20th Amendment. As you are all aware, under the 19th Amendment, there was what was called the Constitutional Council.
Yeah.
Appointments to important positions could not have been made at the choice of the President and the President alone. It had to go through the Constitutional Council, which I would not say the structure of the Constitutional Councils were not all perfect, but at least to some extent it prevented a single individual from taking vital decisions in relation to the appointment to public service or the judiciary or elsewhere.
But Mr. Pereira, if you look at it, now let's take a look at the 18th Amendment to the Constitution.
Yes.
At least 70 to 80% of the members of the public who voted in favor of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution went and voted in favor of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. 7 to 80% of the public representatives who voted for the 19th Amendment to the Constitution went ahead and voted for the 20th Amendment to the Constitution.
Absolutely.
Now they're talking about the 21st Amendment to the Constitution. So isn't this why the people on the streets are now demanding that they are fed up of the 225? All 225 have to go.
Absolutely. Can I make a small amendment to what you said? I'm not too sure whether the entirety of the 225 can be classed together as dishonest, corrupt individuals. There may be at least a few of them who are honest men of integrity. I presume so. It can't be. By law of averages, it can't be that all 225 are dishonest, corrupt individuals. Be that as may, as I see it, if we are to bring some order to this system, the first step that we ought to take will be to bring back the 19th Amendment. In other words, repeal the 20th Amendment as it is and reintroduce the 19th Amendment, which can be done without a referendum. Because as I said, there are a lot of other changes that may be necessary in relation to the constitutional provisions which are there to achieve what we want to. But all that would reflect, sometimes it might require a referendum. So one has to work within the limits placed in the present context. The least that we can do is to bring back the 19th Amendment. Today we see, as I said...
So, no, Mr. Brown, I just want to get this clarified. No, so, are you trying to tell us today that right now the need of the hour is the 21st Amendment of the Constitution, which would be in the guise of the 19th Amendment of the Constitution? One of
the immediate needs.
So,
of course, I must say...
Because initially you said
sorry?
The need of the hour right now is for the President to go.
Yes.
And now
Yes.
you're saying the need of the hour is the 19th Amendment of the Constitution.
No. I think I have been misunderstood.
Yeah.
To start with, people have lost confidence, as I see it. The majority of the people have lost confidence in the Rajapaksa family. People have lost confidence in the President and the Prime Minister. So therefore, if we are to bring some order, there are people on the streets demanding that the two of them go. So if we are to bring back some sanity to this system, I think the two of them will have to go voluntarily and honorably step down.
That is where, Mr. Pereira, the opposition has to play an active role.
But what can the opposition do when the people at the last general election...
Why wasn't a no confidence motion brought or tabled in Parliament last week?
I believe it will be tabled next week.
Why wasn't it done last week?
I don't know the exact reason why it was not done last week, but I'm fairly sure that it will be introduced next week, during the coming week. But what I say is this, as I see it, you were talking of 40 individuals, MPs, who are now grouped together as an independent group, sitting in there, having left their seats in the government ranks. But can I ask you this question? How all 40 of them put their hands up when this 20th Amendment was brought in? Were they a set of idiots who could not have understood the gravity of what they are doing? I'm willing to name them. People like Vimal Veeravansa were in the forefront. They fought so hard to push through the 20th Amendment. Are they a set of idiots? Didn't they understand the repercussions that the country will have to face as a result of?
I don't know, Mr. Pereira, whether they're idiots or not, but one thing is very clear, that based on the wind, the sails change. So,
Sorry?
Based on the wind, the sails change. And that's what politicians in Sri Lanka are very good at. So, Dr. Dinesha, talking about the situation right now with regard to how things are moving about in the country, do we really have a future?
So, if you don't mind, I think I'll also respond to the exchange you had with Mr. Pereira.
Right, yes.
On this whole question of the 19th and the 20th Amendment and the 18th Amendment, I think we also need to remember and recall the 17th Amendment. And what you will see is that there is a group of members of Parliament who keep getting elected to Parliament who have voted for all 4 amendments. And if you were to categorize these amendments, the 18th and the 20th Amendment fall into one group. They strengthen the executive presidency, the 18th far more than the 20th. The 17th and the 19th reduce the powers of the executive and hold the executive accountable to a great extent, particularly the 19th Amendment. So I think it's important as citizens we understand what's going on in Parliament when we keep going back and forth. In fact, I've described this as constitutional ping pong. It's like a game of TT. And now we are waiting to see what's going to happen with the 21st Amendment, because some of the reforms brought in through the 17th and the 19th Amendment have now been revised and is being brought in through the 21st Amendment. Of course, this time the push is to abolish the executive presidency, which I personally think is the need of the hour. So we have a political culture which makes it possible for members of Parliament to raise their hands to the 17th, 18th, 19th and 20th Amendment, and we don't know what they will do at the 21st, when the 21st Amendment is presented for voting. So that ties up with the questions and issues that Sankita mentioned. Why is it that we have a political culture in which it doesn't matter if you change your position so drastically, you can still be elected into power and you can remain in power, or in office rather. I'd rather use the word office than power. So that is where we have to understand that this is not only a question of certain personnel, it is not only a question of this particular parliament, it is also a question about Sri Lanka's political culture. And that is again where these protests become very important. These protests are showing us that perhaps at this moment, the sustainability, of course, only time can tell, is suggesting to us that people are willing to think differently and are willing to ask the hard questions.
Yeah, so Dr. Dinesh, I just want to take your memory back to 2019 when the April 21st attacks took place. Right after the incident took place, people were demanding, or at least the Mahasangha at that time was saying, that we want a leader who's like Hitler. We want an autocratic leader who can put things straight. That is what Sri Lanka is demanding for. And as a result of that, only the 20th Amendment of the Constitution really came into play. And that was one of the reasons that the President also tabled before individuals like Vimalveera Mansaruddega stating that this is the need of the hour. We want to ensure that there is some sort of a legitimate right for the executive to take decisions in the country. So in a situation like that, do you think the people of Sri Lanka want the abolishment of the executive presidency? Is that something that we are hearing from the protesters at the moment?
So that's a fair question, and I think it's important to ask that as a question. So one can only read what the protests say, and how we read what the people are demanding will also depend on how we see what the people are saying. So my understanding is that people are asking for what we call a system change. They're resisting arbitrary use of political office and power. And for me, that can only translate into sustainable reform if you abolish the executive presidency. Because I see that as in the current system as a significant barrier to whatever democratic constitutional government we can have in Sri Lanka, if you're thinking about our future.
Sankita, where does the youth fitting in this equation? We see a lot of them on the streets protesting. What one might wonder is, where will they be when things get back to normal? How can we empower them? Can they just start their own political parties and, hold power?
So that's an interesting question. In terms of, we need to go back to why the youth are on the streets, right? So if you look at how Sri Lanka is panning out right now, you mentioned getting back to normal, but normalcy is so far away. Because, everyone's saying it. It's going to get worse before it gets better. There's no immediate fix that can happen, even if there's a change of government, right? So the next 3, 4, 5 years and possibly more is going to be difficult. And if you think about why the youth are there, it's because the future is really bleak for them. So what we can really hope for is that these youth who are clearly engaging in knowledge right now, because you can see that there is a thirst for knowledge. There are questions about constitutionalism, about law, about asset declarations, recovery, all of these questions being asked right now, and that's a good thing. right? And we see other youth facilitating this kind of knowledge exchange. There's talk about strategic litigation happening. All of these questions are the right questions to be asking, and they're asking them. So there are also different roles for people to play, right? So it is not necessarily, it is not necessarily the solution for these youth who are protesting to then form a political party. There may be some who are so inclined, and all power to them. That's good, because we do need a political culture, like Dinesha referenced, that actually is willing to engage in the nitty-gritty of it, to watch the changes that are happening, because what we're seeing is a lack of accountability, a lack of people holding politicians to account. So having a group of people who have an understanding of politics and who are asking the right questions coming into power, I think would be a good thing. But that's not necessarily the role that these youth should play. They all probably have jobs, they probably have ambitions, I mean, as all youth do, as all people do. So it is, we shouldn't cast everything as, you know, in Sri Lanka we have this understanding, the moment somebody speaks well, you say, oh, you should go into politics, you know, because you can speak well, but we don't look beyond that. And right now, I think what we need is leadership that truly values integrity, that truly can serve in public office as opposed to in public, you know, holding power, and are willing to, as I said before, as I referenced before, to lay themselves bare.
So Sangeeta, we are getting a few questions from our viewers who are watching Face the Nation tonight via Facebook and also text messages. So one question is directed at you. So you are the Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka. So the question is, why isn't TISL not canvassing for making reporting of non-compliance with laws and regulations a requirement of all in the executive, cabinet, public servants and private sector professionals level staff?
Non-compliance with laws?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you look at civil society and our function, one should not confuse it with the function of law enforcement, really. So as civil society, and if you look at the presidency and even cabinet, in terms of non-compliance with the asset declaration law, you saw us in, I think, September 2019, going to the Bribery Commission and filing complaints against the the then cabinet ministers who had not filed their asset declaration. So wherever possible, wherever it relates to our mandate, we do that. But it is for us to demand from law enforcement agencies to do this, and also it is also for the citizens to bring these to the attention of law enforcement where necessary.
Right. So another question for Dr. Dinesha Samaratnam, because we were talking about the abolition of the executive presidency. This question is posed by independent journalist Srinath Fernando. The question is, how does the abolition of executive presidency affect the unitary status in terms of provincial councils, and whether it could revive the separatist tendencies in the future?
That's a question that can be responded in at several levels. So first let me point out some of the assumptions in that question. So if, as we had in Sri Lanka, an ethnic group, a minority ethnic group is dissatisfied and is alleging that the state is discriminating against them and that they don't have the freedom to exercise what we call in law internal self-determination, then my position is, if it's a constitutional democracy, you have to recognize that complaint and make constitutional structures that would accommodate their demands to ensure that they are treated equally, ensure that they have the right to internal self-determination, just like everyone else. A right of a citizen is to enjoy their rights individually and collectively. So if you look at other parts of the world and look at instances in which a demand to secession has arisen, very often that's a matter of last resort, when you find that your demands for equal citizenship are not recognized. So, so that's one part of the assumption. The other is that the executive presidency, one strong lead, I think you referred to this earlier as well, is what's going to hold a country together. I think if you look around in Sri Lanka today, we can see that that's not necessarily true. I think from the 60s in our parliamentary debates, Singapore has been held out as this ultimate goal for economic development, strong leadership that Sri Lanka should aspire to. Now we have a case study. Since 1977, we have had an executive presidency. The promise was economic development, state security or national security, and a moral society. I don't know whether we can say that on any of those grounds we've achieved these goals. In fact, you can argue to the contrary and say we've fallen short on all three. So this myth that one strong leader is going to hold everything together, I think is very problematic, and it's not true in reality. What you need is a system that brings people together, right, and wins the confidence of the people.
So if that case is your assumption and opinion, Dr. Dinesha, what went wrong in 2019 when Maithripala Sirisena was the president of the country and Ranil Wickremesinghe was the prime minister?
Yeah. So there was a crisis of political leadership, I think. That's, again, my personal view. 2015 to 2019 was expected to be an opportunity or a window for reform. But, again, it fell short because there was a crisis in political leadership, failure to work together, and failure to work, again, like I said, not according to the minimum rules of the Constitution, but the spirit of the Constitution and the values of the Constitution.
Right. So failure to work together, you mentioned that in your remarks, responding to the question that I posed. So isn't this the same dilemma that we would face if someone from the opposition becomes the prime minister? He or she would not be able to work with an autocratic president who's sitting on that chair.
So Shamir, again, assumptions here. If I were to see solutions to our crisis, as I mentioned earlier, I think the executive presidency has to be abolished. And if
that's the first step.
I think, in my view, yes, that would be a first step. If the executive presidency is abolished, we have an executive in parliament. And the Prime Minister would be the head of government, would have to work within Parliament with the Cabinet and work as a team. And the term we use is first among equals. And so the model will be very different. So working together, and I mean, we need to have a political culture in which elected representatives do work together. I mean, none of them are there to hold, as I mentioned at the beginning, none of them are being elected to serve their personal ends. They are being elected to serve the public.
So what I'm trying to understand, Mr. Pereira, is the fact that today's meeting, where several members of the 41 group met President, there was a man who was detested by the protesters.
Sorry?
Who was ignored or detested by the protesters. That's Basil Rajapaksa. Can you just elaborate what his role is?
Sorry?
Can you just elaborate what his role is in this whole scenario?
I myself don't know. All what I can say...
Is this all a deal, Mr. Pereira? Because that's what it seems like. Bimala Veerwansa are coming out of the government, Udayagam Mampila coming out of the government, and suddenly all of them get together, unite in one forum, and meet with Basil Rajapaksa. Now, what are they trying to do? Again, hoodwink the people?
I get the feeling, in response to what you said, I get the feeling that there is a drama.
It's all a very good play.
Where the very people who came out recently and sat as independent members protesting against the President and or the Prime Minister and or Basil seem to be joining up with them again to get back to the same system that we had prior to this. In the sense, I get the feeling, as a citizen, I get the feeling that they, realizing that the government was getting into difficulties, they walked out of it and to demonstrate to the public that they are with the people, and having done that, I believe, I don't think they did it honestly. I get the feeling that it is a part of a drama where they came out with a view to, on a future date, to help back the very same people who created this situation to continue in operation.
So what you're saying is
Yes.
the best next actor award at the Oscars should go to Degamampiga Vimali.
Absolutely.
But for how long can they do that, Mr. Pereira?
Not very long.
With the people
Not
outside?
very long. But can I say this? Not very long. Can I add this to what this discussion that is going on? I'm very happy that the youth have come out. But I don't think that we will be able to bring an end to this government by merely getting together at Golface and having a peaceful protest. I don't think. The government will be happy to carry on and on as long as they can and allow these people to be there spending their time at God. I do say the fact that they came out is an achievement. It's great because they have given leadership in whatever way they can. But my view is, this is my personal view, if this country is to forge ahead and come back to normal, this government and or the leadership must go.
That's
and they are not going.
But Mr. Pereira, that's the same thing that is being demanded by the protesters as well.
But merely demanding alone won't help.
But shouldn't it, going back to the same question Shamir asked earlier, I'm just trying to highlight it again, but isn't it the opposition that has to do the needful inside the parliament?
No. Can I respond to that question this way? The government, for reasons best known to themselves, are somehow struggling to survive. The only inference that I can make as a citizen of this country is when a large number of people are asking them to step down. In my view, the greatest service that the President and the Prime Minister can do to this country is to voluntarily step down, which they are not doing. To me, as an observer, what I see is that the reason why they are refusing to do so is because they know.
Mr. I'm trying to figure out.
Just a minute.
No, I'm trying to figure out what you're trying to say, but I want to pose a question to you as well. So you're saying that the peaceful protests that are taking place in Sri Lanka is not good enough at this very moment to demand the President and the Prime Minister step down?
Yes.
So
Therefore, my suggestion is that this is a situation where not only those demonstrators who are on the streets,
right,
but they will have to join hands with the trade union movement together with the political parties.
But that's what they're doing.
No, I don't think.
Were you in Sri Lanka last week? There was a Hartal campaign that was organized.
Sorry?
There was a Hartal campaign that was organized.
No, that's what I say. Unless and until the trade union movement together with the political parties join together, it has to be a joint effort. If all of them get together and pressurize, then
But
only.
Mr. Pereira, how can that happen? The protesters are demanding all 225 should go home. There are political parties who are holding May Day rallies and saying that they are the ones who are the selected ones who should be appointed as the next Prime Minister or the President. They are demanding for elections. Now you are also part of one of the political parties, Mr. Pereira. So you are seated here today and telling us this is not the way to go about. Have you spoken to the leader that you are representing?
No. I don't think. I did say that my personal view is this is not the time for us to have elections. We can't.
Not that we can't, we don't have money.
Absolutely.
There's no way to hold elections right now.
It's not practical.
Forget about holding election. We won't even have power to count the votes.
Absolutely. So therefore, it's an immediate, as early as possible. We have to get rid of this set of rulers, and that can be achieved not only by protesters standing on the roads. The trade union movement. I'm happy that they are planning to have a hartal and a general strike. Together with that, the political movement also, all of them will have to get together and protest as one unit. And if that happens, and then only that I feel that this government might seriously think of stepping down. As I said, what I wanted to say was this. As I stated, one of the reasons why I feel that the government is refusing to step down is because they know the corrupt activities that their people have resorted to, and they know the moment they let go the power, they do not know what consequences.
While respecting your individual thoughts and opinions with regard to the protests that are taking place right now in the country, Mr. Pereira, I have to also mention to you that this time around, as Dr. Dinesha as well as Sankita mentioned before, this is not the ordinary protests that we see in Sri Lanka a couple of years ago.
Absolutely.
Things have changed drastically. Today, people who can afford to pay this price hikes that are in the country are also on the streets. Absolutely. Demanding for the government to go home. So whatever is happening right now is moving towards that revolution that Sri Lanka ultimately needs as a nation. Yeah.
Mr. Pereira, just wanted to bring to your attention also at the start of your address or the start of your sharing of ideas, initially you said you're not for general strikes, but you just mentioned that you're happy it's happening. What is your stance exactly?
Sorry?
At the start of you expressing your views in your first expression of views, you said you aren't for general strikes. Just now you said you're happy it's happening. What is your stance?
No. I'm basically a person who is not in favor of general strikes. Yeah. But a situation has been created within the country at the moment where, in order to achieve what we want, in order to move forwards, it is essential that we bring down this set of rulers. And the only way in which we will be able to achieve, in my view, in my assessment, is only if the trade union movement, the political parties, and of course those who are protesting in the streets, all join together and unitedly resist this government. Then and then only that I feel that they will seriously think of making adjustments.
That's a good point. So, Dr. Dinesh, I want to move it over to you, and I want to mention something that was broadcasted on the news earlier today. A speech by an impassioned former Minister Dayasiri Jayasekara, who called for all the parties to come together and put aside their personal agendas and their political agendas to come and try to solve this issue. And I think something he said along the lines was that, for us to have power, we need to have a country first as well. Now, impassioned all that may be, there was a very scary feeling among the public, particularly on social media, in the week immediately after the initial outbreak of this protest wave at Mirihana, where we saw a parliamentary session and we saw very little done by the lawmakers. Even at this moment in time, you can see the Janata Vimukti Peramuna setting the NPP setting aside certain conditions, the SJB setting aside certain conditions, the 41 independent MPs setting aside certain conditions, etc., etc. But none of them are willing to come to the table and speak about these issues. Instead, they are sticking by their conditions. How important is it that, as Ms. Pereira mentioned, if there is the opportunity to get rid of the Prime Minister and potentially establish a new order, that the political parties firstly come together to put together a succession plan? Do you not think the failure to have a succession plan will also have long-lasting negative impacts, especially on the economic front?
So, if you look at this with good faith, I think maybe we shouldn't assume that there is no succession plan. Hopefully, there are negotiations behind the scenes, confidential, in which party leaders, leaders of each party are negotiating with each other and are developing a successive plan. And I think Mr. Sumandiran did raise this point several times and said, no confidence motion, yes of course, but what is the plan thereafter? I am always skeptical of political parties, but I would still want to leave them a margin and assume that there is some level of negotiation. And for me, a good sign is that each political party is coming out explaining their position and explaining their conditions. So that's good, because then we can decide for ourselves what we think about the positions they're taking, and hopefully then that will help them. See, you can't negotiate unless you clarify your position. So I am comfortable with that, and I'm hoping that in this coming week we see those conditions and hopefully the negotiations that we don't know about yet bearing fruit. But also going back to this question of protest, but I think Shamir also raised another point which now I can't recall. These protests have been very productive if you want protests to be productive. I don't think protests always have to be productive. There's expressions of political agency. We must remember that the first week of April brought about changes which we had not seen in Sri Lanka for a very long time. And as Sankita mentioned, the very fact that they were not led by political organizations or leaders who have political affiliations was perhaps the very strength of that movement. I can't remember the other point you were debating, Mr. Pereira, with Shamir, but if I remember it, I'll come back to it.
Right. So I was debating with Mr. Pereira on various fronts. Just getting back into Sankita. Sankita, interestingly, we talk about this word corruption now. A word that, a buzzword in the Sri Lankan context. We've been speaking about corruption between 2005 and 2015. And then there was a good governance government that came into play, and then they were also corrupt. They were engaged in the central bank bond controversy and so on and so forth. And now then we appointed another government thinking that they would put the record straight, but ultimately nothing of that sort took place as well. There was the sugar scam, there was the garlic scam, there was the tax fraud, so on and so forth. Why do we see corruption in countries like Sri Lanka? Is it an indication of poor governance and weak institutions?
Yeah, so if you look at the definition of corruption that we loosely use, it is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. Right? So, yes, it's easy to bandy around this phrase, this language of corruption,
Right.
but we really need to look at what enables it.
Right.
As you mentioned at the very end there, Shamir,
Right.
there is an issue about our frameworks and about our systems. So we in Sri Lanka tend to always legislate solutions and then not enforce them. We talk about changing laws all the time, but we don't focus enough on enforcing the laws that are in place. Now there are legal changes that are needed, constitutional amendments to legal amendments. These are needed. At this point of time, I think we have come upon another legislative moment, a moment where, you know, government is weak. When government is weak, often there's more flexibility, there's more space for negotiation. So this is in that sense a legislative moment. So we need to put in place those frameworks and institutions that you mentioned, Shamir. And among those, if you even look at the 20th Amendment as it relates to corruption, it did away with, it abolished the Audit Service Commission, it abolished the National Procurement Commission, it removed constitutional recognition of the Commission to investigate allegations of bribery or corruption. It removed that Commission's powers to start investigations on their own. So in terms of even legal amendments, there is space for that, but we also need to focus a lot, and I can't stress this enough, on law enforcement. And going back to Mr. Pereira's point also, there is a need for our public service and our law enforcement to be able to and empowered to disengage from the political system.
Yeah.
So that needs to be built into the work we are doing right now to advocate for better systems.
Yeah, but Sankita,
So
yeah,
can I just add to that, Shamir? we need to also look at the role of enablers, right? You talked about the garlic scam, the sugar scam, the tax fraud and things like that. What we don't see in this corruption, we do talk about how money is taken away from the treasury because of tender processes and all of that. But who enables these? There is a very complicit private sector, including financial services, including legal services, audit firms, all of them that are contributing to this. These are the actors who will create offshore companies, all of this. So we need to really think about these enablers and the systems that will hold them accountable and in check as well.
Sankita, now we saw the manner in which in 2017 on the 6th of April, the Colombo Additional Magistrate found a former Member of Parliament, Domingo Silva, guilty for the non-declaration of assets during 3 years he served as a parliamentarian. Do you want to know how much he was ordered to pay as a fine? 1,000 rupees only for each year that he failed to declare his assets and liabilities. A total of 3,000 rupees. What a joke.
This is true. This is why I'm saying, in terms of our law enforcement, we should be pushing for more. Right? As I mentioned, the law, the asset declaration law even allows for and provides for the confiscation of assets to the state free of all encumbrances if somebody has willfully misdeclared their assets. Right? So these need to be enforced and implemented, and we need to keep questioning our law enforcement authorities about these things.
Sankita, just sticking to this very point, I think there is, like you mentioned, there is also this circle of people around politicians, be it government, opposition or otherwise, that tend to aid and abet these crimes. I think just today you saw the name of Nimal Pereira mentioned with regard to an investigative piece by an Australian media company. Previously, you saw with the Pandora Papers, there were certain high-profile politicians who also haven't declared certain holdings in their asset declarations. These investigations, they haven't resulted in litigation. They haven't resulted in these respective people being held responsible and being taken to the court of law. Although even the president appointed a commission of inquiry, and nobody knows what really happened there. Does Sri Lanka not have the tools necessary in terms of a legal framework to pursue these people and to bring them to book? Or is it that there's just no will in terms of those enforcing the law?
In short, I think it's a combination of both. So if you look at even what came out in the Pandora Papers, TISL just this week actually wrote to the Commission to investigate allegations of bribery or corruption, about what action has been taken pursuant to those complaints that were made when the Pandora Papers came out. Of course, we heard that we've also informed that an investigation had begun. But if you really look at it, this kind of investigation can't happen in a short amount of time. So we need to be also realistic about our expectations. This is no defense of our law enforcement agencies necessarily, but it does take time. And 1 month, 3 months is not enough, but there needs to still be a level of accountability to the public about ongoing cases. Now, we filed a case in 2018 because it's quite relevant right now. When the constitutional coup happened, we, and there's a talk about the backroom deals that may be happening right now. In 2018, October, when there were recordings released of certain bribes being offered to cross over, we filed a complaint, and we don't have an update even up to now about what's going on. So that's in terms of the law enforcement. In terms of our legislative tools, in terms of asset recovery, our legal system needs to seriously be updated and consolidated into one composite law. So what we see right now are provisions in the criminal law, in the Money Laundering Act, certain provisions in the Criminal Procedure Code that allow for asset seizing and freezing, and even in the asset declaration law. But what has been already drafted is a framework for a composite Proceeds of Crime Act for Sri Lanka, and this was even referenced by this government. It was drafted under the previous government, but has been referenced by this government as being before the with the Legal Draftsperson's Department. Now, what this law would do is to create an authority that would bring together the different law enforcement authorities in Sri Lanka, including customs and the Indian revenue and all of that, who can then coordinate better. Because in Sri Lanka we see that there is a serious lack of coordination between law enforcement authorities. And in addition to that, this would propose certain laws, certain new powers into the law, subject to procedural safeguards, that would make it easier to recover assets. That is, to go after the assets under a civil standard of liability as opposed to a criminal standard, where you can proceed against, the state can proceed against the assets and recover them. Then it would also focus on victim compensation. If money has been stolen away from a particular community, then you need to ensure that the money goes back to those communities. And in the same way, just let me complete this thought, even when international asset recovery happens, this can take up to 10 years or even longer. So it's not some fairy tale easy thing to do as a quick fix for the economy. But even when that is done, there is a risk where there are corrupt regimes in place of re-corruption of that money, because the situation that lent itself to this money being stolen. So those kinds of things need to be pushed through in this moment, parallel to the constitutional amendments and things that were the other kinds of reform that we're pushing for.
Absolutely. Now, in line with that, Dr. Dinesh, I want to come to you. Sankhya spoke particularly about the environment in which you can actually litigate against corruption and issues of financial crimes. She also mentioned about steps they have taken in terms of pushing for justice to be sought. From your knowledge, let me ask you in very layman's terms, a question that a large section of the general public tend to ask is that whenever cases are filed against malpractice, against corruption, against money laundering, very often you see that while they are being heard in the court of law, that the cases are often withdrawn, particularly by the Attorney General's department. I think many assume that when the former Justice Minister, the current Finance Minister, took place, given his environment in law or his education in law and his professional experience, that there would be a very new, astute legal system put in place. But even under his tenure, you saw a lot of cases being withdrawn by the Attorney General's department. Why is it that when it comes to very large cases of this nature involving extremely high-profile personnel, very rarely do you see the small man getting this benefit? Why is it that high-profile cases are often withdrawn in the process of litigation?
A good question, and a question I think all of us must ask repeatedly. So the background to this question is that we already have a criminal justice system that is not working well. In fact, it's working very badly. The last time I checked, our conviction rates were at 4%. I think around 2017, there was a parliamentary select committee which said it takes around 17 years for a criminal trial to be concluded. So if you're a victim of rape, for instance, you have to wait for 17 years for the entire process to be concluded. So if the crime took place hypothetically when you were 14 years or even 18 years, you have to add 17 years to that. So it's important to think of the citizen before you think of the big names. For the citizen, the criminal justice system does not work well. We have a very weak legal aid system in place. So these are all parts of this system that is not working well. With regard to the question that you asked, when it comes to criminal trials, the Attorney General has discretion at several levels, both practically but also formally. And in criminal matters, the standard is proof beyond reasonable doubt, which is a very high standard, and that standard is in place in order to ensure that we always preserve the presumption of innocence, which is a constitutional right. So when you have a clogged up criminal justice system, an Attorney General's department which has to manage a heavy caseload, plus a broader context in which the rule of law is weak, and you have politicization of public institutions, my observation is two things can happen. One is that there could be a rush to file a case when the evidence has not been laid out clearly and the case has not been made out to meet or satisfy the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. And as Sanketa rightly pointed out, these are matters which require expertise, investigative specialization, etc. right? So part of it could be that expert criteria is not being met. The other part of the story is that we do have public institutions that are either politicized or being influenced by prevailing political interests of the day. And when those two come together, what we see is what you described. So the 20th Amendment, which Mr. Pereira already spoke about, compromised not just the independence of the judiciary, but it had it basically undermined our entire system of governance by taking out checks which had been brought into place by the 19th Amendment. So in that context, expecting criminal justice to act impartially is an unrealistic expectation to have.
So can I add one thing to what Dinesha said? I think she touched on it. I think it's an important thing for us to train our officers to investigate into crimes which are this white collar crimes which are now becoming more and more technical. And as a result, I think we also have to draw attention to training personnel to meet those requirements.
Mr. Pereira, now the Sri Lankan authorities have already made arrangements to enter into a financial program with the IMF. But as we all know, the International Monetary Fund just don't give away bailout programs or money to help countries struggling with the economic crisis. In that case, can we expect the IMF to ensure that we keep our checks and balances on track so they can offer a program and we can get out of the economic crisis we have in the country? Is it something that we can expect from them?
In response, can I say this? I suppose there are certain criteria that will be laid down by the IMF, and whether we like it or not, we will have to meet those criteria if we are to get any assistance from the IMF and or other international financial agencies. So the criteria that might have to be met may be at a high level. Whether we will be able to sort of respond to it, I do not know. I do not know, but let's hope that we will be able to and try to achieve what we could. Because without the aid of these financial organizations, I don't think we'll be able to get out of this rut.
So, Mr. Pereira, can I ask you a question? Now, you're a President's Counsel. Now, you've been handling a lot of legal cases for a prolonged period of time.
Absolutely.
Now, the people are directly pointing the finger at two people for this economic mess that we are in. The first name is Basil Rajapaksa. The second name is Ajit Niwad Kabral. There is also a third person, that is Dr. P.B. Jayasundaram. So there are three people who are involved in this economic mess or dilemma that we are in at the moment. Can't we take a legal stand under the penal code against these three gentlemen?
I'm 100% sure that we could. Within the present framework itself, I'm fairly certain that criminal action, they can be subject to criminal action, but for that, for us to achieve, there has to be a focused attention devoid of politics, which will have to be gone into. That's why I said at the very beginning that unless otherwise we do not depoliticize the system, I don't think we will ever be able to achieve that. So that's why I said in the long term there are a lot of changes that we may have to bring about in relation to constitutional matters as well as the other legal areas. But at least for the time being, that's why I said, to say the least that we can do immediately is to restore the 19th Amendment.
Mr. Pereira, see, picking up on what you said, how do you think it is realistic for the public to have the confidence that people of this nature would be brought to book? Because the current political culture in Sri Lanka is such that the current government, you've seen a lot of people who are supporters of it by accident or by design being freed from certain cases.
Sorry?
being freed from certain cases
Yes.
during those tenures. It's the same when the Yahapadana government was in power. Before that, when President Mahinda Rajapaksa was there, and before that as well. Is it reasonable that people can expect that the litigation processes, the cleaning up of all this, can be done in the country's best interest and not in the interest of a political party?
I also have my reservations on what you said, whether we will be able to steer clear of all this and achieve what we want to. But can I say one thing, that I'm happy about, in a way, I'm happy about the mess that we have got into just now, because at least some of the people have started opening their eyes. And if that happens, maybe there will be a public demand on the politicians to change course. So therefore, as much as we have got into a serious problem, the silver lining is that as a result, many of us who were keeping our eyes shut in relation to what was happening have begun to open their eyes. And if, as a result, if you could change course and take this country towards in a different direction, I suppose, for what we have lost as a result of these corrupt activities, there would be, on the other hand, something that we have gained.
So we have a question for Sankita, who is the Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka. So Sankita, on the subject of going after the corrupt, you spoke about the importance of declaring assets of the individuals in Parliament. However, let's get realistic. The individual is saying that, let's get realistic, these stolen assets are kept under proxy names. We saw the manner in which how Auntie Daisy suddenly came into the limelight with regard to one of the cases that the Rajapaksas were involved as well. I can name a few like that, but I don't want to do so because of best reasons known to me and the others who are watching the show tonight. So in a situation like that, what's the point of even declaring your assets when you have assets under your proxies who are holding a candle to you?
Yeah, so if you look at an asset declaration form, it has two parts. It has one form, it's an exact replica of the first one, right? The second form and the first form are the same. But what's different is the first form has to be filed at the first date that the person takes public office, and the second form as at the current financial year, as at March 31st of the current year. So just on the face of it, if it were publicly available and accessible, you'd see that there could be an unusual gaining of wealth over a person's political life. Because you can hide assets, but to what extent? You can't pretend to be poor when you're clearly living an extravagant lifestyle. That's one thing, just on the face of it. The second thing is an asset declaration form, as I mentioned, can be used as a basis for legal action. So it is not merely a piece of paper. It can form the basis to establish ill will, to establish that kind of desire to hide something. And also, we need to look at why we are demanding public accountability, right? So public accountability, public declarations leads to public accountability. So that also has a deterrent effect on our politicians. So if I know that my assets and liabilities are subject to the view of the public, then I would hesitate before I engage in corruption. So it has a deterrent effect. So, and then in addition to all of that, we do need law enforcement to do their job. So just public accountability is insufficient, public accessibility. You also need law enforcement to do their job.
How important is it to empower citizens, Sankita? Because we saw the manner in which how Transparency International launched the anti-corruption tool called the Advocacy and Legal Advice Center, aimed at enhancing awareness of corruption and its negative consequences. This was initially launched across 3 major states, that's Romania, North Macedonia, and then Bosnia. Now it's across 60 centers across various continents. How important is it to empower the citizens as well?
So I would say it's extremely important because in Sri Lanka's context, and now it's getting worse, you'll find that people don't even have the privilege to act on their rights, because often you're stuck looking at how you get enough money to feed your children and get them their next meal, rather than being able to, even indulge time to act upon injustices that happen to them. And this is a really sad situation. So wherever possible, you need to provide assistance to citizens and empowerment and knowledge to do so, to be able to stand up for themselves and to be able to stand up against this power disparity between the state and the citizen, between the politician and the citizen. And that's what our advocacy and legal advice centers have been doing even in Sri Lanka. These have been operational for since 2013, and over 9,000 citizens have got access to legal resource through these services. So it's absolutely important, and right now we are seeing fertile ground for this, right? We're seeing people actually keen to act upon their rights. So it's important at this moment to have programs like this, have the kinds of teaching sessions. We're seeing a citizens university, we're seeing teach outs happening at various locations in the country. So it's absolutely important.
All right. So Dr. Dinesha, interestingly, we're talking about parliament and how important parliament democracy is to fight corruption. Do you think parliament democracy is a guarantee to fight corruption at every quarter?
Nothing is a guarantee, and nothing is a permanent or nothing is a quick fix, nothing is a permanent fix. Institutions can only work to the extent that people allow it to work and people are willing to make it work. And before you throw another question at me, let me also remind you that much of the problems that we faced in Sri Lanka in its post-independence history took place under a parliamentary democracy.
Under parliamentary democracy.
Whether it's a language issue, whether it's issue of corruption, whether it's the issue of patronage. It's only in 78 that we introduced a semi-presidential system. From 1948 to 78, we did have a parliamentary democracy. So no one system or design is going to be our savior, and this is not a moment in which we are going to fix everything, even if all align together, and then we can move on and go back to our usual life. If a parliamentary system or a semi-presidential system, whatever constitutional system you have, is going to work, all actors need to be playing their part, whether it's the citizens, elected representatives, judiciary, public institutions, etc.
But isn't it sad, Dr. Dinesha, that during 1948 to 1978, we've had leaders in Sri Lanka who called themselves individuals with the silver tongue and so on and so forth, educated their children in countries like London, and took away the education system in Sri Lanka to a complete abyss, and we are now reaping that negative effects as a result. Look at our education system as a whole.
So if we want to discuss that, I think it's also important to go back in time and understand the ruptures in Sri Lanka's political history. I have begun to make the argument that in fact the authoritarian tendencies that we are struggling with are a legacy of the colonial rule that Sri Lanka has experienced. So we see this cycle of abuse of political power, and it takes different forms in different moments of history. And I think the question of language is really a crisis that was created, which resulted in a 30-year-long war. I don't know whether it undermined our education system in the way you said, but it did result in lost opportunities for many, particularly on this question of developing skills in an international language.
So, Dr. Dinesha, how important is it to get our act together at least now? Because most of the people who we have interviewed on this very show, week in and week out, say that this is the golden opportunity that we have right now. We have the people voicing their concerns and opinions. We have the business community coming to the forefront and saying that this is not something that they would tolerate going forward. We have the intellectual community like Sankita, you and Mr. Pereira coming here as well, talking about the importance of the change of the governance structure in the country? How important is it?
Well, let me say I'm not one of those who would say this is the moment, let's fix everything now because we are all together. We've had many of those moments in our history. Take 94 as an example. I think from what I read of that period, we had a similar moment like that. I don't think we must overestimate the system and place all our hopes and expectations on this moment to resolve all our problems. We've talked about the criminal justice system. We've talked about a possibly corrupt public service system. We've talked about institutions which perhaps don't act independently. I think it would be unrealistic for us to decide that within a month of protest or longer that we are going to be able to fix those things. So nation building is hard work and takes time, and I think we also need to have that long-term view and be willing to pay that price. So for each of us that price would look slightly different. As citizens, for myself as an academic, so it's that kind of commitment I think that is required. I mean, it's great to be excited about the moment.
Dr. Dinesha, there is a saying which goes on to say that Rome was not built in a day, it took hundreds of years to build, but can we wait for that long? Because we've gone through so much of moments in our history. As you mentioned, 994, when Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga became the president of the country, she came with the hope and aspiration that the executive presidency would be completely abolished. That never took place. There was a constitutional amendment or a new constitution that was tabled in Parliament that was burnt in the Parliament House, I recollect, in 1999. And then in 2005, Mahinda Rajapaksa came into play right after the tsunami took place, saying that the end of the war would be the top priority, which happened in 2009. But what took place after 2009 to now is a complete disaster, isn't it? We
Yes
can't
and
wait
no.
for years. We can't wait for years, can we?
Well, that may be right, but unfortunately that doesn't necessarily then allow us to come up with quick fixes. There are no quick fixes, I think. And I don't think it's a linear story of disaster. There are signs of progressive developments that have been made over time. Mr. Pereira spoke about independent institutions and the Constitutional Council. This is something I have studied for some time. If you look at the idea of a Constitutional Council, if you look at the idea of independent commissions, if you look at the idea of independent public officers and ensuring an independent and open process of appointment, these are ideas that have been debated in Sri Lanka since the late 1980s, pushed through in the 1990s, comes into the constitution through the 17th Amendment, and then you see this back and forth. So these ideas have prevailed in our constitutional and political imagination for a very long time. And today we are in a situation where two parties, one in the opposition, one calling itself independent, both who placing their faith in that idea of a Constitutional Council and independent institution. So I see progress in that sense. The other progress that we see, I think, is that even before independence, we've had a history of dissent in Sri Lanka, particularly minorities, whether ethnic or otherwise. Workers have dissented, resisted excessive use of power, exploitation, violation of rights. Today we are coming to seeing a place where the majority is willing to listen to these traditions of dissent. Groups that have been protesting for a long time. Take the mothers of the disappeared. We are, rightly recognizing that the protesting Galle phase has gone on for more than 20 days. There are mothers of children who disappeared who protested consecutively for more than 1,000 days. So we are now at a moment where it seems like the greater number is learning from these minorities or pockets of resistance that have been going on for a longer time. So I don't think it's necessarily a linear story of disaster. There are signs of hope.
You want to pose a question or? Right,
Just a small question, Dr. Dinesha. So whatever the action that we have resorted to, do you think it is sustainable?
I don't know the answer to that. I wish I knew, and I wish the answer was yes. but we all know that protests come at a cost. I know, Sankita, you said that it's difficult for people who are finding it difficult to make ends meet to protest. But also the reality is that it is those very people who stand out on the street and protest. It's very rare for the middle class and the upper middle class and above to protest. And we are in fact commenting that it's a unique thing when it does happen. So I think it's important to recognize that for some of our fellow citizens, it's not a question of whether it's sustainable. It is a reality for them, and it is a compelling political need to resist and protest. For some others, it may be a choice, but whether it's sustainable, I think only time will tell.
How long are we going to protest, Dr. Dinesh?
I mean, I'm not a prophet.
Yeah,
I can
know
tell
you're
you
not
that.
a prophet, but until when? Until when are we going to? Until President Gotabaya Rajapaksa steps down? Looks like a very unrealistic thought at the moment. Is it until Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa steps down? You never know whether that's going to happen in the next couple of days.
So let me
Until
play
when?
at the same game that you're playing and say, in March, if I were to tell you that these kinds of protests were to take place, you may not have believed me.
I would have, certainly.
Oh, yeah, it's easy for you to say that now, right? Very few people would have thought that what we see at Golf Face, and not just the protests, like Sankita said, the kind of political agency that people are exercising, not just at Golf Face, in other places as well, was unimaginable. So I think, and also we have this impulse to want to fix things quickly and to know when is this going to end, when is X going to happen, but this is our political life, our collective political reality. So I think we might also have to live with the fact that we don't know.
Sankita, you were with the protesters. I saw you lecturing them about corruption and, asset declaration.
Sankita was lecturing about
Not necessarily.
Is that the right word? Yeah, it was a
teacher.
teacher. You've met them. We have met them as journalists. You have met them and spoken with them. Do you feel like, how do I put this? This is going to be like what they call the soda bottle.
In what sense exactly do you mean?
As in, what happens when the excitement dies down? Will we return back to the politicians and expect them to rescue us from the situation?
I think Dinesha has answered this question partly by saying we may not know. We may not know. We haven't known what would happen the next day, right? But we've had people coming out in droves. The last question you asked was?
What happens when the excitement dies down?
Yes. So it is a long-term problem. We are usually obsessed with electoral cycles, and I know there is an urgency right now because of the economy, and that kind of thing tends to play a huge role in electoral cycles as well. But reform comes in ebbs and flows. If you look at any kind of democratic advocacy that has happened, advocacy for democratic change, it has happened over many, many years. So we can only hope that it doesn't die down, and it's important to capture as much of this moment as possible. But I think responding to your question, it's important not to let the small backsliding happen. So we don't end up in this kind of, to use your words, Shamir, disaster. Because at every juncture, when something small happened, we thought it wasn't important enough to change our vote, clearly, right? When certain racial slurs were taking place, when certain actions were, touted, and when we saw danger signs, we clearly ignored them. But even if you bring it down to the question of corruption, if we are okay with corruption in our personal life, if we are okay with our MP doing something for us because it's in our interest, and then if we are okay with them playing around with local government money, then we can't expect a change of heart when it comes to the big decisions. And something you alluded to was whether we would have to put our faith in politicians. Yes, at the end of the day, we work through a representative democracy. I don't think this idea of getting rid of all 225 is a solution, that is not a solution right now. There may be those that need to go, and that accountability will and should come. But we need to work through this representative democracy, and in doing so, we need to have our checklist, our minimum requirements of, you know, it might be asset declarations, it might be the lack of a criminal record or criminal allegations, and we need to make those decisions accordingly. And we would only hope that it will not fizz out, you know, it will not fizzle out.
Mr. Pereira,
Yeah, please go ahead.
Mr. Pereira, I wanted to ask this. I should have asked this question at the beginning of the show, but I want to pick a brain on something very specific. We saw when the protests started and people started marching from one place to another, there were certain steps taken by the authorities to suppress these protests. That's what they were called, and the people saw how those things were. We saw social media blockage, but then journalists also went and filed a FR petition at the Supreme Court against it. Something that caught attention of many was how the previous time when the university students were marching towards Galle Face, we saw how spiked barriers were placed in areas like the Chatham Street and in areas where the protest march was taking place. But these spiked barriers were covered with black coverings. So when you see it, you just see it as something that's plain, but when you actually open it, you will see the spikes underneath. Is this legal?
Very positively, it's not legal, it's illegal, and the persons who are responsible ought to be investigated into, and I'm 100% sure that if you can identify them, I'm 100% sure you can proceed against them criminally and get them convicted if the evidence is forthcoming.
But Mr. Pereira,
to say the least, I would say it's an act of negligence, to say the least. But I think criminally it's something more than that.
Because the protest march and the protests were peaceful, there was no commotion.
Absolutely.
But we went and we touched them, and we saw that if you fall onto that, that will actually cause serious injuries.
Absolutely.
Why isn't anyone talking about it?
Sorry?
Why isn't anyone talking about it?
The BASL immediately thereafter protested.
Yes.
And brought it to the notice of the IGP that it should be stopped. And I hope the IGP and the police department has responded to it. I presume so. But very definitely, I don't think the law enforcement officers should have ever resorted to that sort of action.
But shouldn't they at least provide an explanation as to why they placed it? There's no sound yet. I mean, we didn't hear anything back from.
Shall I put it this way? I mean, I am of the view that it ought to have been investigated, but only thing is to investigate. They themselves will be the investigators, so therefore, what we could achieve through that is a question mark. But certainly, if it can be established, if there's evidence available to show them who masterminded that and who assisted, I'm 100% sure they can be taken before court and dealt with. There's no doubt about that.
Right. Dinesha, we posed questions to you before saying, when is this going to end? I want to drag your attention to the year 2010, 2011, where the Arab Spring took place. The Jasmine Revolution was named after the protests in Tunisia. Then the Egypt protest took place, and then that made sure that the president had to leave, and he was sentenced by the court as well in Egypt. And then what happened was the revolution in Libya. The Libyan leader was killed by NATO forces as a result. Then we saw the yellow and the red shirts in Thailand. We've seen all this taking place, and most often than not, it has always ended with a result in favor of the protesters. Now, does it give you some sort of optimism?
You are hopefully you're not painting me as pessimistic about the protest. I'm not pessimistic about this protest at all. All I hesitated to do was put a date on a positive or any kind of outcome or an end to these protests. So let me go back to some of the examples that you suggested. When people protest in mass scale, many things can happen. And one of the things that happens is that many expectations are generated. And very often, all those expectations are either not met or only met in the short term and not in the long term. So that can be a genuine concern that we have as citizens. And the other challenge is for the political expressions to be translated into institutional reform and structural reform. And that is where we are faced with a challenge. Parliament is not responding in the way we would like it to. The executive is not responding in the way that we would like it to. And this exchange about the police also indicates that law enforcement is still lagging behind and is not fulfilling its constitutional mandate. Which is why I said it's too early to tell how these currents will eventually play out, whether they will have ripple effects, what kind of ripple effects, and the ripple effects can be positive, and we have to be open to the possibility that there can be sometimes negative ripple effects as well.
So I'm getting a lot of questions today on our Facebook page, and this is directed at Sangeeta. Sangeeta, civil society speaks high and mighty about the work they do and the work that they have carried out, so on and so forth. Tell us one big win in corruption that have been achieved in the last 10 years as far as Sri Lanka is concerned.
Right.
One big win, one major win.
One massive win has been the right to information law. That was fought for over 20 years and then brought in, and it still stands at 4th place in the world in terms of how good the law is. And it also does quite well on implementation. If you look at the RTI Commission's decisions in the past few years, as of 2018, there was a pro-disclosure order rate of over 85%. Even as of December to, I think, January this year, there was over 80% certainly, a pro-disclosure order rate. So that is one massive democratic win. But also referencing civil society, if you look at the Sil Reddy case, now it's very easy to talk about it as a failure because the conviction was later reversed. However, if you look at that moment when that happened, when the whole Sil Reddy scandal happened, the fact that it was taken to court, that senior public officials were held accountable, that evidence was brought about them, and then of course acquitted. The legal process has to take its course. However, if you think about the deterrent effect that that has on the abuse of public resources by public officials, this is not to say that one law enforcement authority has done its work amazingly well, but as I mentioned, it's ebbs and flows, and the standard constantly shifts to, in most instances, to a better standard. Even if you look at this the whole campaign about asset declarations, just 5 years ago, the amendments that were being proposed was just to repeal the secrecy provisions in the asset declaration law. But now if you look at how the government itself in 2019 committed to having an online asset declaration system that would automatically verify the veracity of asset declarations and throw up red flags. So these standards are shifting, and right now I know the amendments are being discussed, or at least, you know, being thrown around, of actually mandating public disclosure.
Right.
So in terms of our movement, things are moving positively, but not everything is a bed of roses, admittedly.
Sangeeta, it was on the 21st of July 1979, the COPE committee was formed in Sri Lanka. The COPE committee reveals the names of individuals, organizations that have been corrupt, so on and so forth. Tell me one organization or one individual that have been prosecuted under COPE and has been brought under book. Anyone? Does it ring a bell? None. No one.
I can't off the top of my head tell you one person, but there have been cases.
Every single time the parliament is prorogued, all the cases that have been discussed, swept under the carpet, new cases have been discussed about, new committee chairmen have been appointed, and so on and so forth.
Of course, but if you look at the work of COPE, there is still accountability that happens through that. There are questions asked, issues looked into, data set on the public record that then citizens and law enforcement authorities can take up and take action about.
But no action has been taken. We've been talking about COPE revelations every year, almost every year, from 2015 to 2019, when Surin Handinati was the chairman of COPE. We were talking about so many cases, but nothing has been discussed now.
Yes, but it is not necessarily COPE's job to do that. So we've talked about...
But
so that
law enforcement authorities probably are not picking up from where the COPE committee has left off.
This is exactly the point I have been making. Law enforcement needs to step up its game, needs to really disengage from what it sees, disengage from even self-censorship,
Right.
Bowing to the wills of the politicians of the day.
Right.
It is not easy. The system itself needs to be resourced better and also made structurally independent from the political elite and the public
Mr.
official
Pereira,
elite.
Is the opposition united in toppling this government?
Yes and no.
Yes and no.
Yes. I would...
Were you at the protest march yesterday, Mr. Pereira?
Yesterday, no, I was not there.
You were not there. Were you able to watch the news yesterday?
Yes, I did.
Did you see the incident that took place between Harin Fernando and Sarat Fonseca?
Fortunately or unfortunately, I did not.
You did not
I did
see
not.
that. You also cherry picking, Mr. Pereira, with things. You also watch what you want to watch, and what you don't want to watch, you don't watch.
Don't forget that we also have other commitments.
But how did you miss this? How did you miss this, Mr. Pereira? No, so getting back into my question, is the opposition divided? You say yes and no.
No, I would put it this way. As it is on a number of issues, I believe, in the present context, the opposition groups are united and they are moving in the same direction. But I believe there are also groups which are trying to obstruct. As I said,
like who?
I don't know whether I can call it an opposition group, but the group that dissociated themselves from the government and came and sat there with the opposition. Whether they are, I'm still wondering. Whether
how many, in your opinion, Mr. Pereira, in your opinion, if there was a confidence vote or if there was an appropriation bill that would be tabled and there was a show of hands to show confidence, how many does the government have and how many does the opposition have? In terms of number.
As it is, I'm fairly confident that they may be able to muster anything around 85 to 90 votes.
80, who?
85, the opposition.
85 to 90 votes.
That's my assessment.
Okay.
I may be wrong. But if you can add the 40 who are there, then of course there will be the 50%. But I'm not too sure whether a good part of the 40 who went and sat there would stand by together with the opposition.
Mr. Pereira,
when it is put to test.
I'm trying to figure out the conduct of the opposition because it seems to be a little bit perplexed. Tell me, Mr. Pereira, if you don't mind, please, for the benefit of our viewers. Now, the 41 members who are with the SLFP are not with the UNP.
Not with the
SJB, sorry, SJB. UNP as one member.
If I may say, my personal feelings are that they are still with the port tour.
Are they still with the port tour?
That's my view.
So if there was a no confidence vote that would be tabled in Parliament in the next couple of days, what's going to happen?
I believe yesterday the leader of the opposition raised this issue.
That you have watched.
Sorry?
That you have watched.
That I did.
Yeah, you didn't watch the other part. You're also, Mr. Pereira, a proper political actor. Experience in the political forte.
No,
I can see that very well.
The channel, there are two channels that I watch, and in both I did not.
I did not see it. I'm glad you're watching the right channels. Right.
You know what they are.
Yeah.
Now, what I say is, what was the question?
Oh my God, you forgot the question also. No, my question was, now if there was a no confidence motion tabled in Parliament.
That's why the leader of the opposition yesterday, I think, made this remark that we'll be able to put those people to test when this resolution is taken up.
But is it about,
Because then they will have to decide whether they are going to vote in favor or against, and that will show their color.
But
and as far as I'm concerned, I get the feeling that the majority of them probably will hide, will absent themselves, and or not vote in favor. That's the inner feeling that I have, because I think they are.
So all this effort taken by the opposition or the SJB is in vain.
No, not that it's in vain. Don't say that it's in vain. That will at least.
I feel sorry for the youngsters who are protesting opposite Golface.
No. That will open the gates where people will be able to see who they are and what they are and what they stand for, whether they are honest with what they are saying and doing, or whether they are playing tricks with us. So at least to that extent, those who, assuming that they don't vote in favor of such a resolution, they will be exposed.
They'll be exposed.
I think that's important. That's important.
Mr. Pereira, we have parliamentarians or members in the former cabinet who doesn't even know how money is being brought to the country. They think that money is being brought when some donor gives money, that the money comes from ships to Sri Lanka. Then you have members in the previous cabinet who went on to say that no matter what decision the president takes, they will stand by the president's decision. So in a situation like that, do you expect anything good happening in the next coming couple of days in Sri Lanka?
I'm not too sure, but I'm hoping against all hope that there will be a change of heart and that we'll be able to move in the direction that we want to.
Right. Anyway, Deshan, any questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Dr. Dinesh, I want to ask you something that's going to slightly move away from the political side of things. I think, particularly in the current context, it's very easy to pin the blame on the politicians with regard to a lot of the circumstances that we are facing today. But what I think a lot of people need to understand is when a government is elected, they are compelled to work with the state. And regardless of who is in government, who is the elected representative, minister, etc., it is very often the state officers that tend to run the orders of the day in terms of executing these policy decisions. I don't know if you're aware, I think a few years ago there was also a few academics who stated that we might have misplaced our debt even. So things like that is not up to the minister to maintain documents of, it's up to the state. Now, with regard towards actually going through the processes and setting up the right foundations for us to move forward as a country, how important is it, number one, for us to get our state sector right? And number two, given the restraints that we now face and the animosity the people have towards the politicians, how realistic is it that we can reform the state and ensure that they work in the best public interest? Because I don't have to tell you that there is a bit of power being thrown around sometimes by the state officers when the political authority gets a bit weak. How realistic is this?
So to answer your first question, it's very important that we reform the state sector. In fact, one of the earliest ideas of independence in our constitutional history is the independence of the public service. We had that under the Salisbury Constitution, lost it under the 72, and have not regained it since. So in most of the constitutional reforms under the 78 Constitution, we have not had support for making our public service independent. So that's a critical part of this problem, which needs to be addressed, which has not been addressed. Then coming to your second question about how realistic is it to reform the state, I think we do have a hopeful story here. So let me go back to the earlier discussion about the Constitutional Council, independent commissions, and independent processes for appointments to high office. That is part of that effort to reform the state. Traditionally, we've had three branches of the state: executive, legislative, and judicial. And over time, now we recognize what we call the fourth branch. And this fourth branch typically includes independent commissions and high officers, which, as you rightly say, must work independently, must work based on expert evidence, expert opinion, etc., in order for the executive, legislature, and the judiciary to work well. So the efforts at reforming our state in our recent past through these ideas of bringing in a constitutional council, ensuring independence in appointment processes, is a step in that direction. And as I mentioned earlier, we are now at a time in our political history where even two parties who are not working together are agreed that that is in fact the way forward. So it is realistic, and in fact we have built that idea over time, and I would argue that it has now consolidated as the way forward.
Right. So I have one final question from one of our viewers. I'm just going to take one question before we wrap up the second round and move on to the final round. So this question is directed to Dr. Dinesha. If a car is parked on the pavement in front of our gate, the police comes and rings the bell and tells us to remove it. If not, we would get charged. How is the law different for the Prime Minister? Buses are parked right along temple trees and there is no room for pedestrians to walk. Yet they are allowed to be parked for days. How come the law is different for the common man and the law different for Mahinda Rajapaksa? After all, he was elected to serve us.
So the law is not different. The law is the same. It's the enforcement that is different. And if I recall correctly, I think lawyers have already made complaints to the police. So hopefully the police will take action.
Right. So I go in for a short commercial break. Tonight our topic of discussion was power, politics and money, fighting corruption in the new normal. We go in for a short commercial break. When we come back, it's the final round. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation to hear the thoughts of Mr. Srinath Pereira, Dr. Dinesh Samaratna and Sankita Gururatna. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. නිතරම හොඳින් සබන් යොදා දෑත් සෝදන්න. සබන් හෝ විසබීජ නාශක මධ්‍යසාරයක් භාවිතා කර දෑත් පිරිසිදු කරන්න. සැම විටම අන් අය සමග මීටරයක දුරස්ථභාවයක් පවත්වා ගන්න. හැකි සෑම විටම නිවසේ රැඳී සිටින්න. නිරතුරුවම නිවැරදිව මුඛාවරණ පළඳින්න.
We're stronger together.
තනිව යන්න බෑයි කියන කාරණේද අධ්‍යාපනයේදී මම කියන්නේ ප්‍රධාන වශයෙන් සිදු වෙන දේ.
අපිට රුසියානු සපත්තුව මේ ලංකාවට දාන්න බෑ ඒක ලොකුයි. චීන සපත්තුව සීන සමාජවාදී ඒකත් හරියන්නේ නැහැ. ඒක මේ කකුලට පොඩි. අපි අපේම සපත්තුව මහ ගන්න ඕනේ කියලා.
එක්සත් ජාතීන්ගේ මානව හිමිකම් කවුන්සිලය කියලා කියන්නේ මානව හිමිකම් පිළිබඳව ලෝක පාර්ලිමේන්තුව.
අපි පරිසරය ගැන දෙකක් තිබුණා.
මම ඉස්කෝලේ යන කාලෙත් මේක තුන්වන ලෝකයේ රටක්.
දැන් මම මැරෙන්න යන කාලෙදි ලෝකේ රටක්.
ආණ්ඩුව රූපාන්තරණය වෙනවා රාජ්‍ය බවට. එත දෙකේ එත පහේදී තමයි මේ වතු ඔක්කොම නැෂනලයිස් කරේ.
එහෙමයි ධර්මශ්‍රී, රට ගැන විතරක් නෙමෙයි මම ගැනත් මම බය වෙලා ඉන්නේ.
අපනයන කවුද කරන්නේ? කවුද විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයට ගියද? කවුද අපේ ව්‍යාපාර කරන්නේ? විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයට ගියද?
Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We start off the final round with Mr. Srinath Pereira, President's Council. What is the way forward for Sri Lanka?
As I see it, the only way out will be, as I said earlier, whether they like it or not, His Excellency the President will have to step down. If he is really concerned about the people and the country, the greatest service that he can do to all of them is to gracefully step down. If that does not happen, I get the feeling that things will become worse every day. And if they don't do that, the only inference that I can make is, as a citizen of this country, they are not doing it for the only reason that they feel that their people, their kith and kin have been up to all types of corrupt activities, and they know that the moment they give up their power, let loose, they may have to face bitter consequences. If not, I think they should give their ear to the requests that are being made by the majority of the people, including those who voted for them, and gracefully step down, because that, I think, will be the greatest service that the Rajapaksa family, especially the President and the Prime Minister, will be able to ever do for this country. And thereafter, it's for the others to pick up from that point onwards and see in what way they can move forwards in order to take this country out of this debacle.
Mr. Pereira, usually in the final round, I do not pose questions, but I have to pose this question to you. So let's say, hypothetically, the Rajapaksas resign.
Yes.
Does that mean this would be the end of the political dynasty that they've been enjoying for the...
No, certainly not. Certainly not. We cannot be sure. But at least that will give us a chance, an opportunity, and also hope of a change. It may happen, it may not happen, but at least we will be able to be hopeful of a change. But if this system, these people continue, I think it will be a downward movement every day. Nothing better than that.
From the frying pan into the fire.
Absolutely.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Srinath Pereira, President's Council. I now move my attention to Sankita Gunaratnam, Legal Officer, Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka.
Yes, so what the present crisis is showing us, if nothing else, is that we've begun to see as a society how corruption that happens at high levels and out of sight and sometimes even out of our control really has come back to bite us. It's really affected our day-to-day lives, our conveniences, our basic services. So for years there has been a sense that it's okay if some people skim off the top if we are not affected, if we have national security, if we have stability. We didn't care enough about democratic freedoms and things like that. And all of these have now come back to us very clearly, showing us that corruption at any level should not be tolerated. So that is a moment of reckoning for our society right now, and that's a good thing at the end of the day. I really wish it didn't have to get this bad for us to come to that realization, but we have. So things like grand corruption, things like, tender processes being subverted, or, commissions being taken, roads being built over and over again, are red flags, are warning signs that we need to heed next time around and over again. That's one thing. And then, in terms of the immediate problem of corruption, because we've talked about the larger framework now, what immediately needs to happen is that we need accountability for corruption. And in order for that to happen, we need to fix this trust deficit, and we also need to heed the call of the people to freeze assets, to seize assets, to bring criminals to book. So in order to do that, we need to first enforce the asset declaration law as it is. We need to make amendments to allow public access, to use technology, to to really use technology to solve the problem, because these are simple fixes. These are done across the world. And then we need to consolidate our proceeds of crime framework so that we can negotiate with other countries. We can enter into mutual legal assistance agreements with countries where the assets that have been stolen from Sri Lanka are currently situated. If we do that, and this is in existence, this piece of legislation in draft form is in existence already, so this is a moment for Parliament to really think about that, take that, open it up for public debate, and pass it through. Then our topic today is about the role of money in politics as well. So that's where often our vested interests, the vested interests of politicians and even public officials who have control over certain levels of control over public finance, that comes into play. Where do corporates come into this picture? Where does the private sector stand? Are they lining the pockets of their politicians in order to get benefit once they are in power? So we need a proper campaign finance regulation. In Sri Lanka, we saw members of parliament say, checks came to light saying certain people took 1 million rupees or something in public finance. We saw in the 2015 elections there had been foreign governments, state-owned enterprises giving money to our election campaigns. But those interests could not be, they were not justiciable before a court of law because we didn't have a proper election campaign finance framework in place. And for that as well, there is a draft in play. There has been, the former cabinet's approval for this. This needs to come into effect. We also need to reform our procurement system. We have, when we talked to the Prime Minister, when he was Finance Minister, about the need for accountability in our procurement system, that is in the tendering processes, we were told that there is a website called Promise.lk that gives procurement information to the public. But that only is a space for suppliers to register themselves and for procurement notices to be uploaded. That is not accountability. That is not transparency. That is insufficient. If you have data about who gets public contracts and who are doing public works into the hands of the people, then that data can be aggregated to show red flags about how procurement deals are being abused. During the COVID pandemic, there was so much money in play and there was so much space for corruption, and clearly what came to light today also was that corruption was happening indeed. So all of these systems need to come together, and we as the people need to push for this, but we need to know that no system, even the best system, even the best constitutional system, can't proceed positively until we keep insisting that our politicians, that our leadership, starting from the very top, don't tolerate corruption at any level.
Right. Thank you very much, Sankita Gunaratna, Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka. I now move my attention to Dr. Dinesha Samaratna, Senior Lecturer, Faculty of Law, University of Colombo.
I think it's important to end while reminding ourselves that we are here because our country and our people, we are all facing tremendous levels of anxiety, stress, suffering. Lives have been lost. It's an economic crisis that has been brought about due to a failure in political leadership and management. But in the same moment of anxiety and suffering, we have also seen unprecedented levels of willingness to engage, hope, and the impossible happening within very short periods of time. Earlier, so I finally remembered the point I wanted to make an intervention on, and I'm going to use this time to do that. The exchange between Mr. Pereira and you about the non-feasibility of a general election. I think that assumption has to be questioned. Now arguments are being made about the relative cost of a general election not being that much compared to the losses that we are facing on a day-to-day basis, both because of the economic crisis but also because of the other issues of mismanagement. So I don't think a general election should be taken off the agenda that easily. So if we take stock now, much is exposed, the system is exposed, our poverty is exposed not just in terms of lack of forex, but our ethical poverty, moral poverty, and our political poverty. So what is going to happen in Parliament this week will tell us whether, despite their lack of imagination and lack of willingness to commit, whether our elected representatives will do the right thing. That remains to be seen, but I do think that it will be a mistake on the part of the political actors to underestimate people's agency that has been exercised so far. And personally for me, seeing proposals for abolishing the executive presidency is an encouraging sign, and I hope that there will be political will and consensus to see that reform through. Because ultimately, if we do want the macroeconomics to fall in place, we cannot avoid the fact or deny the fact that we need a stable government that is also legitimate, not just legitimate in terms of certain sectors, but domestically and internationally. No one can work around it. It's a cold reality that we have to contend with. So if we agree with that, and if we agree that the executive presidency has not delivered what it ought to have delivered, then I think well-meaning citizens, well-meaning elected representatives, or right-thinking elected representatives should get into action and see this process through, so that the other hard work, we can begin to do the other hard work that is urgent and pressing.
If I may, Dr. Dinesh, I'm going to pose a question to you.
So you're cheating, you're not playing by the rules.
No, just a very, very simple question. You can probably not answer if you don't want to, but it's my responsibility and duty to pose a question to you. If there was a message for you to give the protesters, what would that message be?
Continue to do the remarkable work of peaceful protest and engagement and education that you're engaging in. It is important for this political moment, and there's something else I thought I should say. As a Sri Lankan citizen, as someone who's given birth to children who identify as Sri Lankans, I have always struggled with the fact that when I tell the story of Sri Lanka to my children, there are very few moments that I can point to and where we can discuss it with positive discussion around it. Whatever happens next, as long as we live, we can, I think, all look back on these days and tell our children that here is a time when Sri Lankans across a very broad spectrum came together. It was not protest and dissent in pockets divided, but this is a protest to which we take our children, and where we talk about the national anthem, the flag, statues, books, games, plays. So I think these protesters acting in their own organic way have given us a gift of a history that we can now pass on to our generation. So for that, I think I have to thank them rather than giving them prescriptions as to what they should do. Thank you.
And then we can all say that we were part as far as turning the country's pages were concerned, and we're part of turning history as Sri Lanka is concerned. So thank you very much, Sankita Gunratna, Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka. Sankita, I'm extremely sorry for getting your portfolio wrong right at the start, but I corrected it midway through when Shehan told me that it's supposed to be Deputy Executive Director of TISL. Thank you very much, Sankita, for joining us this evening. So profusely sorry for that. Dr. Dinesha Samaratna, Senior Lecturer, Faculty of Law, University of Colombo, as well as President Counsel, Mr. Srinath Pereira, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation tonight. Thank you very much, Deshan. Thank you very much, Azra, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. And thank you very much, Shehan, back at home, recovering from COVID, for putting up a good panel and helping us present facts to the general public. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself becoming the villain. Take care and good night.